One of the most discussed aspects of Scientology is inevitably the celebrity membership. The founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, had an almost infinite amount of terrible ideas that he inflicted on the world by his writing and other mediums. But he also landed on a few brilliant insights into the human condition. His idea to market Scientology via celebrities and to set up an entire parallel infrastructure within the cult to cater to celebrities, the celebrity centers, was on the bleeding edge of advertising back in the 1950s when he decided to go with the religion angle. The phrase about the religion angle is actually a direct quote from Hubbard. LRH, as he's known to his followers, was deeply mentally ill, but he found a way to direct his insanity in ways that were beneficial to himself. For example, Hubbard had hypergraphia, a symptom of disorders affecting the temporal lobes of the brain, which caused him to have an endless compulsion to write. Hubbard directed this to become perhaps the most prolific published author in several of the pulp genres, and to create the elaborate structure of Scientology, which exists in millions and millions of Hubbard's words, both written and dictated in lectures. There are many parallels and connections between L. Ron Hubbard and the story of Richard Gaiman. Gaiman's most formative years have many direct ties to Hubbard himself, and they also stand apart in other similar ways. Both men are unique in their ability to conquer multiple different genres of writing. Both men display symptoms of long-term untreated mental illness, and both men also appear to have a bottomless capacity for inflicting pain on the people they were closest to. But also both men had an affable, charming, and warm side that made the layers of derangement all the more baffling. Both appeared to use their prolific writing to address their mental illness or to somehow find a way to process it. And of course, both were inflicted with the virus of Scientology to one degree or the other. I recently read and listened to materials on the alleged crimes of Richard Gaiman, the podcast and the Vulture article that came out recently. And there were just a lot of different things that I came across that made me think of Scientology in reading about the story of Richard Gaiman. And not just like in a general sense, but about the particulars of the warped philosophy and specific elements of the cult mindset that differ sharply from how most normal humans would conduct themselves. Last year on this channel, I did a series of 3 videos that uncovered some very odd developments in the story of Scientology. And I've been following Scientology and other high control groups for many years. But my videos didn't actually center their focus on Scientology itself. Instead, there was a very strange situation, to put it mildly, that was happening on the outskirts of Scientology, where it seemed like the virus that is the cult had hopped species was now infecting anti-cult communities, if you can imagine that. Gradually, it dawned on me that L. Ron Hubbard had really created something like a sophisticated computer virus, but for the human brain. And it makes sense when you think about how Scientologists spend countless hours in what are known as auditing sessions and in the beginning levels where they practice drills. You know, if you've seen the documentary film Unclear, you'll see examples of stuff like bull baiting and the other beginning drills where you do stuff like stare at someone else in the eyes and just very odd conditioning drills like this. And all these sort of drills mainly consist of repetitive tasks, and many of which create like almost hypnotic states.
Start. You are one ugly mother. You know that? Flunk very, very so slightly. Start. You are one ugly mother. You know that? Okay. Flunk, you twitched. This is the make-break point here now. You're going to teach somebody how to have some forbearance and tolerance and ability to take some, you know. This is the most highly criticized drill, but it's the most highly sworn by drill too. It's called bull bait, okay?
And also, another common thing in these high control groups with these drills, or sometimes known as intensives like in NXIVM, the conditions practiced in these drills and sessions last many hours in a single day and for many consecutive days in a row oftentimes, which can lead to altered states and also, lack of sleep and other fatigue syndromes can induce these sort of states. And so what I was observing in this community of ex-Scientologists was that they're, in effect, recreating their own version of Scientology, and it wasn't even totally clear whether or not they were aware they were doing it, but it made me realize how strong the conditioning of Scientology is, and really the conditioning of any group that uses these sort of coercive control techniques, and how much more difficult it is to deprogram people who are born into these groups or raised in them, like Richard Gaiman. Second generation cultists had the coercive programming installed during their formative years. And so they end up having to completely remap their understanding of reality if they ever leave the cult. This is a very difficult task in the best of circumstances, and it normally requires prolonged assistance of people who specialize in this sort of deprogramming therapy. Beyond the few relevant names within the Scientology fold that still inspire the general public's curiosity, one of the items that tabloid media and social media will reliably speculate on is about celebrities that aren't officially connected to Scientology, and the media then sort of engages in some sort of connecting of the dots about whether that celebrity might be a secret Scientologist. The names that you often hear about like this are like Will and Jada Smith, Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis, and maybe David and Victoria Beckham. In that group, there's a lot of obvious connections for many of these names with Scientology. For example, like with Ashton and Mila, they were super tight with Danny Masterson and a group of influential young Scientologists in Hollywood in the aughts, where they're co-stars on that 70s show. So press coverage of the courting of folks like the Smiths or the Beckhams by Scientology often engage in this kind of speculation. And in a sense, it's easy to see why, because the whole celebrity Scientology connection has been a huge boon to the tabloid industry, and there aren't really that many new celebrities joining up, if you haven't noticed, and a lot of the ones that were prominent are dying off, like Kirstie Alley. So there really aren't that many celebrities in the fold anymore, but it's still interesting to note like how powerful those connections are in terms of propagating the idea of Scientology in this connection. Because of the recent explosion of allegations against the writer Neil Gaiman being in the public consciousness, we can now add another bold-faced name to the usual suspects of speculation of ties to Scientology, as previously there had been very little awareness of Gaiman's actually very deep and lifelong ties to Scientology, but now those are becoming more known about because it's chronicled, especially like in the Vulture article that came out recently. Along with the alleged sexual assaults, Gaiman had somehow found a way to minimize the part of his story in the discussion around his life and career about Scientology. I had only known very rough, sketchiest outlines that Gaiman was connected to Scientology myself, and that's only because I'm a longtime subscriber to Tony Ortega's Underground Bunker website, which is peerless in its depth of coverage on the weird world of Scientology, and I had sort of gone pretty deep into digging around this subject in making previous videos. So I don't think that the general public at all had any awareness, even really, of Richard Gaiman's connection to Scientology. And this was best covered, I think, in a pretty short space in the recent Vulture article, which described how Gaiman had a background of the child of parents who were some of the most prominent and public-facing Scientologists in England. And this was also mentioned in the podcast by Tortoise Media called Master, which was quite the ride, and I would recommend checking out as well. The podcast came out about 6 months ago, and a number of other outlets have written detailed accounts, but the ones I am going to most focus on mentioning are the podcast Master and the Vulture article. But there's been a ton of recent press coverage based on that, and a lot of different YouTube videos I've seen, but I haven't really seen anything that like focused on specifically the influence of Scientology in this case, and I thought I might have something to add there. With this knowledge has also come a further texture of the Scientology background of Neil Gaiman, and also parallels or echoes between what Scientology teaches you and the toxic relationships that Gaiman seemed to have a pattern of repeating over his life. I noticed a number of things that seemed to me to be obvious connections in the way that Gaiman perceived the world, or seemed to perceive the world, as a child of some of the earliest and most ardent adherents to the Scientology cult in England. Some of the things that Gaiman was engaging in terms of his behavior with his victims can also find echoes or parallels in the recent case of Danny Masterson, who was recently convicted in trial of sexually assaulting 2 women in the aughts in LA. It was a very interesting case that was highly followed, especially within the world of Scientology watchers. Scientologists have a very peculiar belief that if something bad happens to a person, like if they get into a car accident, this is pretty much like the classic example, they believe that that person pulled in those tragic situations into their lives. And they believe that they pulled this in based on wrongs that that person did, perhaps like in a past life, because Scientologists believe in this philosophy of past lives, and that, you know, that same spirit or Scientology Thetan is keeps getting sort of reanimated into different bodies after periods of dormancy. It's a very a lot of moving parts in trying to describe that, but the effect that this ends up having in cases like sexual assault, or any sort of case where there's like an imbalance of power, like in the Masterson case or the Gaiman case, is it offers a very easy justification for powerful men like Masterson or Gaiman to excuse their own behavior and just see it as a sort of cosmic settling of scores for a past tragedy in their lives, which led to this transgression in this life, the sort of converse of pulling it in. And also, they can easily blame the victim or offload some of the responsibility because, well, it's just based on something that the victim had done in the past, and so this is all part of the grand scheme of things. The Vulture article in the Master podcast documented a number of instances, interestingly to me, where Gaiman gave his alleged victims large cash settlements as a way of settling abuse allegations. And Scientologists often use cash settlements to solve serious breaches. In a very similar scenario also happened in the Masterson case with one of his victims, where he gave her a cash settlement in a private negotiation with lawyers involved. And also involved in these are often non-disclosure agreements, which are also a very common tool in the world of Scientology. This is based on the doctrine of exchange in Scientology, which is one of the fundamental tenets of their religion or cults. L. Ron Hubbard wrote about how it's what's known as a major overt, which is a Scientology term which is roughly analogous to a sin, to be what's called out exchange. And to be out exchange is to not provide the same value to somebody that they provide to you. So this principle of exchange is the justification for Scientology charging ever-increasing prices for auditing or spiritual training as Scientologists move up the bridge, which is known as the bridge to total freedom, to the upper levels of Scientology. These exchanges all have the obvious issue of favoring the organization of Scientology. So you don't have to be too much of a skeptic to poke holes in the philosophy when you really sort of rummage around the different parts of Scientology and the different people involved. Like on the one end of the spectrum, the opposite end of the wealthy celebrity parishioners like Danny Masterson, you have like the Sea Org members, and the Sea Org is like the inner hardcore of Scientology, like the priests or monks who work for essentially no money. Some of them are given like a stipend of, like $50 a month or something like that, but essentially no money. And these folks are subject to just totally Spartan, awful living conditions and working conditions. And they often escape, members of the Sea Org, or what's known as below, and try to get out of their indentured servitude by just fleeing into the total unknown world. And Scientology, as part of this doctrine of exchange practice, then has the gall to send them what's known as a freeloaders bill, where they try to collect money for all of the free auditing that Sea Org folks are supposed to be treated to. So in actual practice, this doctrine of exchange always ends up favoring Scientology, oddly enough. And this sort of gets into another aspect of the way that Scientologists think, and it's sort of like an ends justify the means type of aspect of their philosophy, where they can always fall back on the justification that Scientology's trying to save the world or clear the planet, as they call it, or basically, which means they want to convert everybody on Earth, or like a high enough percentage of everybody on Earth, to Scientologists so that Earth can be saved against future calamities. But in matters like the Gaiman or Masterson cases, this logic becomes even more fuzzy, if that's possible, because in general, Scientologists are forbidden from reporting another Scientologist to the regular authorities. The exchange of money for serious offenses has become normalized in Scientology, and victims have been conditioned to assume that the bad thing that happened to them is because of some wrong that they committed in a previous life. And this was really laid bare, especially in the recent Masterson trials, when one of the victims on the stand testified about, how it was against the rules to report somebody else, and the defense, and Masterson's defense tried to challenge this, and and the prosecutors were on the ball and found like the exact section of some Scientology text that talked about how this was actually a major crime in Scientology to report other Scientologists to the civil authorities. So there's a very deep paranoia against the establishment and against any sort of institutions of what's known as the WOG world, which is too weird to even get into, which is kind of the case with a lot of Scientology stuff. But they have a lot of specific Scientology terms for things, and it's sort of like another layer of the conditioning, in that they have almost their own language full of these really strange acronyms and sayings. And one of the things that I've heard with a lot of people that are ex-Scientologists that have been out for a while is like one of the hardest things to shed is just all of this specific language that you learn. And so there's a lot of different layers to the conditioning of Scientology. One other thing in the article that caught my eye was there was a quote from Neil Gaiman's ex-wife, Amanda Palmer, that reminded me of the mindset of devoted Scientologists, and also this earlier thing we were talking about the ends justify the means mindset. And the quote was in the context of Palmer having befriended a much younger woman at the outset of the pandemic, who Gaiman was alleged to have assaulted. The quotes read, "Palmer's vision of herself as a central figure of a utopian community could, according to some of her friends, make her careless with the young, impressionable women she invited into her and her husband's lives. Her idealism could blind her to reality," one friend says. So this utopian outlook, the ultimate ends justify the means mentality, is reminiscent of the sort of certainty that Scientologists have. And one thing that I really came away with in doing a series of videos about Scientology and the ex-Scientology community is that the relentless inward focus of Scientology is one of the components that I believe creates its uniquely corrosive philosophy. This is why I think Scientology, despite being such a tight-knit and totally integrated community on the one hand, is also so internally chaotic. Like, if you know anything about Scientology or get into a lot of reading about the history of the different sort of splinter groups in the independent Scientology movement, is it's just totally a dog-eat-dog world where there's just always drama and infighting and purges. And, this is a characteristic that has carried over from the original L. Ron Hubbard days to the current leader, David Miscavige, who's been in charge since the 80s. And perhaps it's even become a lot more of a feature during the Miscavige years. It's only gotten worse over time, it seems like. And it's really sort of creates this dynamic where it's a group of people, but they all have like a form of delusional narcissism induced into their personality. It's almost like they're all the sort of people who are at like a mental hospital that think they're like Jesus Christ or something like that. It's very odd. And I think a lot of this is because of like the auditing and focus in your Scientology training, or however you want to describe it, is all on your life and your past lives. And basically you're like sort of creating your own almost science fiction fantasy story where you have like this grand scope of your own cosmic journey and your own personal improvement. Those are like the main focuses. And so if you look at like the executives or the executive group under David Miscavige, there's like a ton of examples of basically the bottomless capacity for high-ranking Scientologists, especially to abuse each other and stab each other in the backs. There's another really evocative scene in Going Clear, where all these executives have been essentially in prison for years in this facility in these locked trailer homes called The Hole, and they're doing like a musical chairs exercise to decide who gets to stay and who gets basically kicked out into the world that they don't know.
One night, Miscavige comes into the Hole with a boombox.
He said, "I'm going to teach you all a lesson. We're all going to play musical chairs."
Playing that music, and stop it, and everyone have to grab a chair.
And there's one person left standing.
The last person who remains gets to stay. Everybody else, you're expelled, you're going to be thrown out of the Sea Org. These people were fighting to stay in the Hole.
Because once you're in Scientologist for years, you essentially are not only like terrified of the outside world and been trained to think that everybody outside there is crazy and like wants to kill you, but you just have no contacts there. So it's, I think, sometimes more comforting the devil that you know than the devil that you don't. And so that's why I think a lot of times people stay, is because they spent their whole lives there and they have no connections outside of it. But Scientologists, and also I think to a degree utopians like Amanda Palmer, present the opposite mask of their true selves to the world. And they're, they say that they're engaged in this grand form of altruism, but we really see the truth in their actions, where they really show no regard or consideration to those who are in their close personal orbit. And I think maybe this is one reason why Palmer and Gaiman seem to have some sort of identity, or were a successful couple for a number of years. I also thought it was interesting how the author of the Vulture article that detailed Gaiman's abuses describes how Gaiman has written about terror from the point of view of a child in most of his books. The point of view of Scientology on children is very unique, and there's maybe connections or parallels to draw to the emphasis that Gaiman places on children in his stories. I haven't really read much Neil Gaiman, but just sort of hearing about the fantastical plots in Gaiman's work does call to mind both the work of L. Ron Hubbard, who's another prolific writer of fantastical genre fiction, as well as the free associations that happen when Scientologists enter into auditing sessions and track past lives and go off into weird, far-off alien lands. Within the beliefs of Scientology are that there are, many different civilizations that have previously interacted with folks on Earth. I'm sort of hesitating here because there's like different Scientology terms for this, and I don't want to get off track. But Scientologists also believe in something analogous to like out-of-body experiences, which they would refer to as going exterior. And there's a similar motif in the story world being observed by the protagonist in a trance-like remote perspective present in the work of Neil Gaiman, and especially the book that's described most in the Vulture article, the autobiographical work, The Boy at the End of the Lane, or whatever it's called, that was published in 2017. The article then goes on to describe how Gaiman especially identifies with one of the children protagonists in his work, and how this might be based in whole and part on his own fantastical upbringing as a child of Scientologists. And also briefly mentions that Scientologists believe that children are basically adults in little bodies. And this is a very core belief to Scientology and has a lot to do with how children are raised in the cult. And the article also talks about a very infamous incident where L. Ron Hubbard severely punished a 4-year-old for tossing a watch into the water while on the Apollo, which was L. Ron Hubbard's boat where he's running for the government in the 60s. Again, another story that's way too long to get into here, but one of the most interesting passages I found in the article was about how Gaiman's parents were some of L. Ron Hubbard's closest followers in the mid-60s, where there was a couple-year period from, I believe, 1965 to 1967, where L. Ron Hubbard was actually running the cult from England, in a state known as St. Hill. And this part's really fascinating to read. Is again, I'd heard like bits and pieces of some of this stuff over the years, but the account presented in the Vulture articles is very clear and suggestive of how totally committed Gaiman's parents were to Scientology. And the article also highlights how England, especially during this period, was like one of the most important parts of the world to Scientology, because Hubbard had left the U.S. because of issues with the U.S. authorities, and ran and set up shop in England before he again ran afoul of the government there, which was when he left essentially any nation state to go ride the high seas in international waters on the Apollo. Which is, the Apollo era is like one of the craziest, wildest eras of Scientology. And just as an aside, I highly recommend checking out Mike Render's autobiography, A Billion Years, and rest in peace, Mike Render, because it has a lot of very fascinating details, because Render, as a teenager, was basically shipped off to sail with Hubbard on the Apollo. And Mike Render is one of the few people to have been a high-level executive in Scientology and spanned the eras between Hubbard and Miscavige, and worked with both of them intimately over many years. And so, Render was really one of the essential authorities on Scientology, and his book is fantastic. I bought it in both hardcover and the audiobook version, and I'd recommend either. Really a well-written and fascinating insight into Scientology. The Vulture piece then describes how both of Gaiman's parents left their professional careers and moved to be by L. Ron Hubbard in East Grinstead in England, where Hubbard was running Scientology from during the mid-60s. And they eventually became part of the spy wing, or an inner hardcore version of Scientology, which the intelligence arm of Scientology back then was known as the Guardian's Office. And it had like a series of scandals, shortly after this period, which also involved L. Ron Hubbard's wife, and a bunch of people went to prison because of this, because they were spying on like U.S. government offices and stuff like that. Again, the history of Scientology is very deep and crazy, and it was later rechristened in Orwellian fashion to be called the Office of Special Affairs, which is what it's now referred to. But Neil's father, David, was actually the spokesperson for Scientology in the UK. And this is significant because eventually there was like a very big report that was released in England about Scientology that basically declared it as something that was like a very bad thing and something not to be supported. And this pattern of falling out with governments and governments declaring Scientology as like an evil over the years has been one of the reasons why I think this sort of paranoia exists and is very strongly represented in the philosophy of Scientology. Just as like a general theme as well, there's also a strong connection, I think, and something that I kept coming across in the article and podcast, where there's like a missionary zeal of Scientologists and a sort of confidence that you get from that sort of indoctrination. And it's mentioned at one point in the article that Gaiman had this sort of confidence early in his career as a writer. Neil ventured into genre writing in the 80s in a period that was like the transition period from L. Ron Hubbard, when he was getting very ill and eventually died in the 80s, to the era of David Miscavige. And during that period, which is a fascinating period, which is when a lot of the independent Scientology stuff came about, a bunch of the old guard, or the old people that were executives like Neil's father, it sort of got purged by the incoming Miscavige leadership, and were essentially defrocked. And this happened to David Miscavige, Neil's father. He was declared to have been in breach of Scientology ethics, and it was a whole thing. But it was this exact period where Neil transitioned from being a Scientologist auditor to getting involved in genre writing. And I'm not sure if that's like a coincidence or if that is unrelated, or maybe it just, I don't know the exact nature of that connection, but in a weird way, there's a mirror between a lot of different parallels anyway, between David Miscavige, the guy who took over for Hubbard, and Neil Gaiman. The article talked about how Neil grew up in Scientology and his parents, would use Scientology practices to raise him. There's also like a really interesting part where, like in 1968, Neil Gaiman went on to the BBC to try to refute these reports that were coming out in England about how bad Scientology was, and sort of try to show that like he's like a real smart kid, and so Scientology can't be all bad. But the article also related this incident where David, Neil's father, would like submerge Neil in a bath of cold water as some sort of Scientology remedy or weird child rearing practice. And this immediately reminded me of an incident that's described in David Miscavige's own childhood. Sort of part of his creation myth, or the reason why he believed so much in Scientology, where there's a very similar treatment where David's father, Ron Miscavige, who's also passed away but had written a book called Ruthless, and had eventually left the church while his son was in charge, had described how he had put David into cold baths and showers as part of a treatment that had cured David's severe asthma as a child. L. Ron Hubbard had like I said, millions of words about like the rules of Scientology, and some of them were a bigger part of the philosophy and themes that were repeated again and again. But he would also have just like weird little things about like this dunking kids into cold water, or like just weird policy directives that were so generally insignificant. Like he would talk about how the best way to wash windows was with old newspapers and vinegar or something like that, and then because he said that he's the source, like that's still the way that they're supposed to do it to this day, which is just kind of crazy. And there's so many different things like that, but because of their conditioning in Scientology and that relentless inward focus, one aspect that Gaiman and Miscavige had is like the same sort of unshakable belief in themselves, and that's something I think you get from all those crazy early things like they're called like the TRs, where you're basically like trying to learn how not to flinch in these things called bull baiting sessions, or just having all this crazy stuff done to you to sort of condition yourself to be sort of immune to other people's emotional states. And they were both, and they're of a similar generation, which is I think one reason why it's interesting to compare them. But Gaiman and David Miscavige had both been programmed since they were kids as to find like a way to like impose their will and get to the top. And I think that's like another reason why Neil Gaiman and David Miscavige seem to be so indifferent to the pain of others. And there's like a passage in the Vulture article where one of the women that Neil Gaiman's alleged to have assaulted just basically talks about how he didn't seem to really have any consciousness or regard for like how he was treating her, how much the abuse hurt her. And I think that's sort of very much something that can be conditioned into somebody, or may have been a result of his Scientologist upbringing. It's Scientology is like a very Machiavellian world, and Gaiman himself was quickly rising up the ranks in Scientology as an auditor. He was I can't remember, like some high-ranking auditor in the levels as like a young adult, and then he appeared to leave Scientology, or at least having a direct connection with Scientology because of his father's defrocking. What was clear to me, though, in the breadcrumbs I saw in the Vulture article and the podcast, was that even after Gaiman like left or stopped being like an auditor and moved to being like a genre writer, he still had a lot of connections to the world of Scientology. And it's not really, I guess what I'm getting at is I'm not really sure at one point Gaiman actually left Scientology, or if he ever really did, or what his the status of his connection to Scientology is. He remained married to a very devoted Scientologist long after this period when he got started in writing, and Gaiman's also still very close to family members of his who are still in Scientology, and is even part owner in a business with some of these family members, which is hard to imagine that he is at least not still in the good graces of Scientology because of the Scientology practice of disconnection. Like if one of your family members leaves Scientology or falls out with Scientology, you're not supposed to have a connection to them because they're a bad or suppressive person. So all this stuff is like very suggestive, but not necessarily dispositive. Doesn't really tell you for sure where Neil Gaiman lies in terms of his current relationship with Scientology, but it all sort of leads me to believe that he is at least, still in the good graces of the cult, which is, it might have something to do with his celebrity status, because you definitely get treated much differently if you're high profile. Finally, I want to end on one further observation I came across in the middle of the Vulture article. The piece describes a crisis in the marriage between Neil Gaiman and the musician and artist Amanda Palmer that happened back in 2014. Palmer was 8 months pregnant with their first child, and for whatever reason, it's not exactly clear in the article, Neil admitted to Palmer that he had slept with a fan in her early 20s, taking this woman's virginity, and now this woman was going crazy, according to Neil Gaiman. As a result of this, the fallout of this was essentially that Gaiman told Palmer he was going to make a commitment to change, and they entered some form of couples counseling. And then this is, I believe, related through a third person, because the authors of the Vulture article didn't talk to Palmer directly, but essentially the upshot of all of this was that Palmer became aware that Gaiman had never been in treatment before and realized the true extent of this guy's issues, how, sort of deeply psychologically unwell he was. Of course, this made me think of one of the strongest beliefs in Scientology is that the mental health field and psychiatrists and psychologists especially are like one of the greatest evils, one of their big bad enemies. They consider these professions to be their mortal enemy on earth and one of the biggest obstacles in suppressing the technology of the great L. Ron Hubbard. It's hard for me to say whether or not Neil Gaiman might be some sort of crypto Scientologist or whether or not there's still lingering effects from the spell of Scientology that was cast on him on his youth. But I think it's mostly a distinction without a difference, because it doesn't really matter to me whether or not Neil Gaiman's a Scientologist in good standing or what his ties are to it, but it's more about how Gaiman has continued to suppress and hidden this part of himself, and like never, his wife of some years, who's immediately having a child with, didn't even realize the extent of this. I mean, it's really sort of a lame thing, even on that level, not to sort of tell people about this part of yourself. But it's also that he never meaningfully attempted to grapple with this issue. And maybe this is the strongest connection between Scientology and the allegations of abuse that are now coming to light. Like, I don't make all this video and bring up all these points to try to excuse Gaiman. I think a lot of it's more about trying to explain who he is and why he might be like that. But also, there's a lot of people that have come out of Scientology and realized that they had issues as a result of it and tried to get help and make meaningful changes, have sought appropriate therapy. And it's clear that Gaiman never has done that. And whether or not Scientology is directly related to him abusing other people, I think there's obviously at least some connection there. I think the real fault of Gaiman is that he has never really attempted to grapple with that stuff. And maybe he thinks his therapy is writing. Well, I don't think that that's cutting it. I think that him putting out art into the world is great, but him sort of not doing anything else to address his core issues is the real problem. And so hopefully this was interesting, and hopefully people will take it in the way that I meant to serve this as not like a way to excuse his behavior, but as a way to add context and to point out the real issue is that Gaiman has never really tried to work on himself and has suppressed these parts of himself, which has probably contributed ultimately to his downfall. So it'll be interesting to see where this case goes. And, if there's any other good long form articles or podcasts, I might do a follow-up video to try to see if there's any other connections that I come across. I know there's other things that I thought, but I just kind of wanted to center it on like a few of the main sections. So I definitely appreciate your time, and thanks for checking out the video.